so let's talk through each of Games Workshop's Combat Patrol boxes and which ones are the best and the worst. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a bit of an overview of discount sets for Warhammer 40K, looking at the Combat Patrol box sets for every faction, and talking about which ones really stand out as good buys and which ones are maybe a bit more passable. As I'm sure plenty of you watching will be aware, the Combat Patrol boxes are Games Workshop's 40k value sets. They have been really quite consistent with them throughout 9th edition. Each time a codex gets released, a Combat Patrol box gets released. They currently cost £90, $150 or €120 at time of recording, and included within you typically get an HQ choice, a troops choice, and another unit or two to make a little mini army. The idea is that they're 25 power level, so you could play a game of narrative Combat Patrol. In terms of points, they can vary anywhere between something like 400 and 800. In general, they're seen as a pretty reasonable way to start collecting each army, as they basically give you a small discount off the kits that Games Workshop would sell separately, usually in the region of around about 25% to 45% off what Games Workshop would sell them for, and that can add up to a fair bit of money when you're talking Warhammer, so I feel like these things are usually worth keeping in mind as an option. If you were thinking about picking up one of these box sets, then I'd bear in mind that the discount might be a tiny bit deceptive. It kind of depends on whether or not you want those specific kits that are included in the box, and some bits like upgrade frames might be a bit underwhelming. And I'd also bear in mind that in most places in the world you don't have to buy directly through Games Workshop. Third-party retailers and local gaming stores often have them at discounts, for example Element Games in the UK, which I'll link down in the video description. They have these box sets for a further 15% off, and I think it's always quite a good feeling when you're getting a discount stacked on top of a discount. In any case, in this video we'll go through the box sets that I think are either strongest or weakest, and talk through some of the advantages and disadvantages, including the discount that you get, the unit composition that's included, and how well they function in-game at the moment. I've organised the box sets into 3 rough tiers, starting with more underwhelming ones and ending up with the best, though obviously this, like a lot of other things in 40k, is a bit subjective. If you wanted to say the exact contents of the Thousand Sons Combat Patrol, then obviously it's going to be a good deal for you. Still though, if we're starting out with some of the weaker ones, then at least in my opinion, I feel like the Deathwatch, Death Guard, Thousand Sons and Space Wolves box sets are all a bit underwhelming in terms of contents, though that's not to say that they're unusable. First up, we've got Combat Patrol Deathwatch. The Space Marine Combat Patrol sets generally tend to be Primaris Marines with some upgrade sprues. In this one you get a Primaris Lieutenant and Apothecary, 10 Intercessors, 3 Aggressors, and then 2 Primaris Deathwatch upgrade frames with the Litany Xenomortis on the shoulder pad. With the Space Marine ones, it really does depend on whether or not you value those upgrade sprues, which I generally think are a little bit on the pricey side from Games Workshop. If you don't count them, then individually the kits would be £113, but if you do want them, then they'd be £132, so you'd either have a fairly poor discount of £21 or a fairly reasonable one of £32, depending on how much you actually wanted those bits and how much good value for money you found them. In terms of the actual model choice though, I don't think it's that great. Intercessors and Aggressors are pretty reasonable choices for Marines in general, maybe not all that massively exciting for Deathwatch specifically, particularly with special issue ammunition being a bit on the weak side. I guess Aggressors can be a bit more interesting now they've got that Kill Team Strike Force. You could get an awful lot of auto wounds across with those flamers, I suppose. Otherwise, the Apothecaries are generally useful, though the Lieutenant just seems like a straight out bad pick for Deathwatch, seeing as they get wound rerolls automatically within their chapter tactic. Just seems like there's a bit of overlap there. The main reason that I feel this one ranks so low though is mainly just because of that Lieutenant. As an HQ model it is just incredibly plain, regardless of what Games Workshop charges for it. You could easily kit bash one of them with a fancy power sword and helmet out of a standard Intercessor, and having 2 characters in the box set just makes it a bit character heavy in my opinion anyway. For example, the Blood Angels box set is kind of similar to that, but you trade out one of the characters for an entire tank. Add that to fairly mediocre savings, and I do feel that this is probably one of Games Workshop's worst offerings on the Combat Patrol front. Still though, not unusable if you're playing Deathwatch and you do desperately want those fancy shoulder pads. Moving on, we have the Death Guard Combat Patrol, and this one and the Thousand Sons they made a very weird design decision with, basically deciding to fill out the box set with a massive amount of their cultist hangers-on and not really that many Space Marines. In this box set you get Typhus, a Biologus Putrefier, 7 Plague Marines, and 30 Poxwalkers. It does feel like a zombie horde with Space Marines attached, rather than the other way around really. To be fair to the box set and maybe being a little bit harsh on it ranking it in the bottom tier, the discount isn't actually too bad. You get £139 worth of models for it, giving you a 36% discount overall. But it really is a box set that you probably only want to get one of at maximum, just due to having quite so many zombies there as opposed to a more balanced force. And also including a special character in Typhus in the box set also kind of limits the potential that it's got for buying multiple copies of. You can't field multiple Typhuses in one army. I guess you could maybe convert one to be a Lord of Contagion if you did desperately want to get 2 boxes. Perhaps the very weirdest decision to do with the box is that you can't actually field it as a legal Death Guard detachment in its own right. Poxwalkers have that Plague Followers rule, which means that you need to have just as many core infantry units as you do Poxwalkers, and in this box set you've got at least 2 Poxwalker squads and 1 unit of Plague Marines, so you can't actually field the box set as a 500-point army. In game, I wouldn't say that any of the units contained within are really all that bad though. Poxwalkers are a nice mindless horde to hold your objectives for cheap, plus can do some mortal wounds. Plague Marines got very good with their war gear updates. Typhus is perfectly usable, and you could potentially use him as a generic Lord of Contagion if you wanted, and the Putrefier can help out Death Guard melee a bit. All the models are fairly recent sculpts as well. The Poxwalkers are monopose, but that doesn't really matter too much within a big horde. I think for me, I have slightly mixed feelings about this one. If I was starting Death Guard, I'd get 1 copy of this and exactly 1 copy. You get a good bunch of chaff, some Plague Marines and some characters, but it isn't really all that good unless you have a few other units to back it up. Realistically though, out of the 2 god-specific legions who have their Combat Patrol box set, I do think that Thousand Sons have it a fair bit worse than Death Guard, and this set just seems flatly worse than the Death Guard one. In Combat Patrol Thousand Sons, you get an Infernal Master, 20 Zangors, 5 Scarab Occult Terminators, and then a few sets of the 40k upgrade kit for the Zangors, allowing you to arm them all with chainswords and auto pistols if you want to. Discount wise, just on the raw models themselves, it's £120, so around about 25% off. Pretty mediocre to be honest. For the upgrade sprues on this one, I'm really not that bothered. I think at least in game terms at the moment, you're best off not using the chainswords for the Zangors, and I'm not personally convinced that they add an absolute ton aesthetically. Again, like the Death Guard one, it really does feel like a mutated cultist horde of mainly models that were primarily aimed at Age of Sigmar, and having just 5,000 Sun Space Marines in the box set does feel like kind of an afterthought. In game terms, the Infernal Master and the Scarab Occults are both very strong units. The Zangors are really quite underwhelming at the moment, and aesthetics wise, I think when most people want to collect Thousand Suns, it's more the Space Marines that draw them in rather than the Zangors. I guess it doesn't hurt enormously though to get you a few units of chaff on the table, in addition to the Space Marines that you pick up elsewhere. Again, like the Death Guard one, I don't think it's unusable. I think maybe if I was starting Thousand Suns, I might get 1 copy of this. That would have you well covered for Zangors, but I do feel that they would have won a lot more points here if they'd traded out one of the units of Zangors for Rubic Marines. It's a bit sad having a starter box for Thousand Suns and not getting the main troops choice. Lastly, for the kits that are ranked a bit lower, we have Combat Patrol Space Wolves. As with the other Space Marine box sets, it just doesn't feel enormously flavourful for the actual faction of Space Wolves, and the unit mix is maybe a touch on the weird side, and the discount isn't spectacular. In terms of models, you get the unique Primaris Battle Leader, a slightly more wolf-coated Primaris one, 10 Intercessors, 5 Reavers that you could build as Hounds of Morkai, and an Invicta Tactical Warsuit Scout Walker. You also get a couple of copies of the Space Wolf upgrade sprues as well, so you could put some wolf heads on their shoulder pads. Discount wise, again it does depend on how much you value those upgrade frames. It's only 22% if not, but 33% if you want them. So again, I do feel that there may be a bit of a tipping point. As mentioned, I do feel the unit mix is a little bit on the weird side. Intercessors are generally helpful, but maybe the Invicta and the Reavers are just a little bit on the niche side. Only really all that relevant if you want to embrace the Phobos super sneaky Space Marines aesthetic. The Battle Leader is admittedly a fun sculpt for Space Marines, so it's a bit of a flavour win, but isn't all that strong in game. Overall, it's just a kit that I struggle to be too excited about on any level. I guess at least compared with the Deathwatch one, you do get more miniatures and also a big walker as opposed to a second character. Maybe one to consider if you're starting Space Wolves, but certainly doesn't seem to be an auto pickup to me. Moving onwards, here are the boxes that I'd say are generally interesting pickups if you are starting an army, all of which I think have really quite good points, but maybe if I'd been trying to design the Ultimate Combat Patrol box for that faction, they would fall short in one way or another. I've ranked quite a lot of the Combat Patrol offerings here: Space Marines Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Adeptus Mechanicus, Grey Knights, Astra Militarum, Militarum Tempestus, Chaos Demons, Tau Empire, Black Templars, Necrons, Tyranids, Orks, and Chaos Space Marines. Starting out with Space Marines, and Combat Patrol Space Marines is definitely an interesting pickup. In the box you get a Phobos Lieutenant, 10 Infiltrators, 3 Suppressors, 3 Eliminators and an Impulsor, though I would bear in mind that bar the Impulsor, all of these are monopose miniatures. You don't get, say, the option to assemble the Infiltrators as Incursors, or arm the Eliminators with las fusils. It is a box set that I might have ranked towards the higher end of this tier, perhaps would have been a contender for top tier, as it does have one of the best value discounts out of any of the box sets in the range. If you are comparing against the full multi-part plastic kits, in theory you get a 47% discount here, really quite good from Games Workshop. In terms of just raw models to put on the tabletop, it's very, very good. Aside from the models being monopose though, the other major drawback to this box is that it's just very much Space Marines of a certain flavour. It's very themed around the Phobos Space Marines, very sneaky tactical type Space Marines that work well for things like the Raven Guard, but maybe just might not be quite as in line with the aesthetic of some of the other chapters. I think they're just a little bit on the divisive side. Some people really like the look of them, when some people just aren't that bothered. I can't help but think a standard Space Marine box set might have been a bit better with some more normal troops like Intercessors and less of a scout themed force. Other interesting things for the box set are that this is the only place that you can get suppressors at the moment, the same for the Phobos Lieutenant sculpt, and in game I do think that the vast majority of the choices are usable. The Eliminators in particular are really strong, but in gameplay terms the Impulsor really does feel completely out of place in this box set. There isn't really anything that it wants to transport. The Infiltrators generally want to be setting up with their pre-game deployments and hiding on objectives in the midfield. Overall though, despite its shortcomings, I still think it's a very decent box. You get a lot of Space Marines on the table for the money. Definitely one to consider if you want to either start the faction or get some scout-themed reinforcements. Moving on, we've got Combat Patrol Blood Angels, which weirdly enough might be a better box for starting Space Marines than the Combat Patrol Space Marines one, but seems to be a pretty underwhelming box for actually starting Blood Angels themselves. In the set you get a Primaris Lieutenant, 5 Intercessors, 5 Incursors that can also be built as Infiltrators, 3 Aggressors, and again an Impulsor. You also get 2 of the Blood Angels upgrade sprues as well, but unlike the previous ones you actually get a very decent deal on just the miniatures alone. It's a 36% discount just based on the miniatures, even more if you do want the Blood Angels sprues. I think for a general starting point on Space Marines as a faction this does seem really quite nice, to be honest. You get a nice mix of units with 1 tank and then 3 different squads. In game maybe the troops are the most strong at the moment, the Aggressors and Impulsor are a bit more questionable, but not so bad that they can't have a place. Overall I think it's a really reasonable box to start Space Marines with. It just doesn't really feel very Blood Angels at all, as they're generally all about the close assaults and jump packs and things, and not really much about this box says that. If they are committing to Primaris only though in these box sets, then I guess I can see why that's the case. I guess at some point they will update the Blood Angels miniature line in a similar sort of way as they did with Black Templars, but until then their most themed miniatures in things like Death Company and Sanguinary Guard remain Firstborn only. Sticking with the Marines once more, and here we have Combat Patrol Dark Angels. In this one you get a Primaris Chaplain, 5 Intercessors, 3 Inceptors, a Redemptor Dreadnought, and 2 of the Dark Angels upgrade sprues. Kind of an interesting one value-wise this one. It's a fair bit worse than the Blood Angels one, only netting you a 24% discount. You do get fewer miniatures with this, though again it does get a bit better if you want the Dark Angels upgrade sprues. I feel like the reason that this one sets itself apart from things like the Space Wolves one is just the mix of units that are included, all of which are really quite nice ones for a Space Marine army, and I don't feel like there's any real bad choices in this set. The Redemptor Dreadnought in particular has been a bit of a powerhouse of 9th edition, really good firepower backed up with some melee. Intercessors and a Chaplain are always useful, and while the Inceptors aren't super strong, they're at least kind of interesting in Dark Angels with those Plasma Exterminators, getting some massive damage 3 shots with their stratagem. Overall, despite having a fairly low discount, it still seems absolutely fine as a starting point for Space Marines, or maybe non-Deathwing or Ravenwing Dark Angels. Pretty nice Primaris miniatures that would find a home in most Space Marine armies, I feel. Moving beyond Space Marine land, and next we have Combat Patrol Adeptus Mechanicus. In this one you get a Tech Priest Engineer, 10 Rangers that can be built as Vanguard, 3 Cataphoron Servitors, and an Onager Dune Crawler, all of which are pretty nice detailed models from the relatively recent AdMech range. The army is kind of notoriously expensive to collect, but this does get you at least a pretty reasonable discount at 33%. The balance of units is pretty nice. You get both troops, 1 Gun Walker and 1 HQ. Perhaps in terms of in-game power at the moment, the Skitarii troops are by far the best, but that might more speak of how AdMech isn't doing so well as a faction more than anything else. Overall, I'd say that the box set is solid but maybe not enormously standout. A good unit selection, an okay discount. You don't get all that many points in the box though, but a perfectly reasonable way to get a core force of an AdMech army together. Next up we've got the Grey Knight Demon Hunters. In their Combat Patrol box you get a Librarian, 5 Strike Squad Marines, 5 Terminators and a Nemesis Dread Knight. Quite a small and elite force as you might expect for Grey Knights. Admittedly though, the discount for this one isn't particularly great, only 20% savings compared with buying the kits individually, though I believe that this is currently the only place that you can get the Librarian in Terminator armour. That one's currently gone away for a bit as part of Games Workshop's rotating range thing. To be honest though, despite this one having fairly mediocre savings, I do think that the unit selection is pretty on point here. The Grey Knights army basically gets built around the Terminators, Strike Squad and Dread Knight, and this kit has all 3 of those. Basically you could get multiple copies of this box set and have no problems at all. In game terms, literally every one of these units is usable and competitive for the Grey Knights army. You could maybe field the Terminators as Paladins perhaps, and the Librarian can be very scary, hosing out a whole bunch of mortal wounds. The kits contained are maybe a little bit more dated by 40k standards currently. They are from Games Workshop's more recent range of plastic sculpts, but perhaps older ones within that subset, and certainly the Dread Knight has always been one that's divided opinions on the model. Overall, I feel like this is one of the box sets that, despite a low discount, is still absolutely excellent to pick up. You basically have the entire Grey Knights range in a box, and you could certainly get multiple copies of this, maybe even convert the Librarian into a different HQ choice if you didn't want to field 2. Next up we have Start Collecting Astra Militarum. They don't have a Combat Patrol box yet, as of course the Guards still don't have their Codex. This one is likely to be phased out very soon, so is likely only going to be available in third-party independent retailers after it goes away. In the box you get a Commissar, 10 Cadian Infantry, 1 Heavy Weapons Team and the Leman Russ Battle Tank. I would bear in mind that the Cadian Infantry don't get that upgrade sprue, so they are the more basic and non-updated kit. It does look like Games Workshop's going to be updating the Heavy Weapons Teams as well for the Guard, so again you do run the risk of that one being an obsolete model if you do pick this up now. Currently from Games Workshop, this one's £57.50, $95 or €70. The sets individually would cost around about £92, giving you a rough discount of around 38%, though I would bear in mind that you're not getting the full Cadian kit as it's sold at the moment. Obviously with the Guard Codex coming out very shortly, what's good and what isn't could certainly change quite a lot. It's hard to imagine standard infantry and Leman Russes ever being completely obsolete in the Codex though. In general they tend to be the units that are targeted for buffs if they ever get too weak. Otherwise for unit choices, I will bear in mind that this is the Leman Russ kit and not the Demolisher, so you get the Eradicator Nova Cannon and Vanquisher options, but not say the big Plasma Gun or the Demolisher, so you are a little bit limited as to the choices there. Overall, as it goes from Games Workshop, they're pretty reasonable discount on core Guard choices, but I feel like the box set is maybe a little bit of a questionable pickup with updates incoming so soon, perhaps mainly because of the Heavy Weapon Team update and not really knowing how easily you're going to be able to field it. The other Guard option is Start Collecting Tempestus Scions, and again there is a pretty reasonable chance that this just disappears when the Guard Codex comes out, at least potentially when they've sold their stock. Again this one comes with that same Commissar miniature, the one with the plasma pistol, 2 copies of the standard Militarum Tempestus Scion kit, you can build them as command squads if you want to, and then a Taurox or Taurox Prime transport. This one's a bit more expensive than the Guard Start Collecting one, £65, $110 or €85. It's kind of similar to the Guard one in terms of savings, around about 37% on the upper end for Games Workshop. Currently Scions are a bit of a mini army within the Greater Guard Codex. They don't have many options, basically just troops in transports, so this will get you some of those. Obviously any discount on the Scion squads is pretty handy if you are collecting Scions. The Prime is pretty nice to have. The Commissar's a bit redundant in game terms with them though. I think you're really going to want to field one of those alongside Scions. As miniatures go for the Guard, these ones are all more relatively recent ones, nothing too dated here, and nothing that's going to get made obsolete by the Codex. If you do want a Scion contingent in the army, it doesn't seem like a particularly unreasonable one to pick up in anticipation for the Codex. I would bear in mind that there'll also be that Kazakin kill team on offer at some stage, which you might or might not prefer the aesthetic of. Next up we've got the Demons, and this is Combat Patrol Chaos Demons, very much a corn-flavoured Combat Patrol, 1 Bloodmaster, 3 Blood Crushers, 10 Flesh Hounds, and a big 20 Bloodletters. As Games Workshop's Combat Patrols go, it is really quite a generous offering. You get £163 worth of models here, which equates to a 45% discount, definitely on the upper limit of Games Workshop's models. I think this one definitely could have been a candidate for putting in top tier. You do get a lot of plastic models and points for the money invested. I believe that this box clocks in at upwards of 600 points, which is pretty good for a Combat Patrol. Obviously though, this one is very much demons of one given flavour. It's very much corn demons, not Nurgle or Tzeentch or anything. And it's maybe not the most helpful that this one seems to have replaced the other Start Collecting boxes for the demons only the Slaanesh one remains on offer besides this. In game terms, with the new Demon Codex, pretty much all of these are usable, the Bloodletters are great, the Flesh Hounds are useful, and if you can deploy any up close with a demonic locus from something like Be'lakor, then so much the better. As models go, the Flesh Hounds are relatively recent. As plastics go from Games Workshop, the Bloodletters and the Blood Crushers are slightly on the older side. There are some mould lines and things that are a bit visible, but in general they hold up well. As it goes though, if you do want to start Chaos Demons, or Khorne Demons in particular, it seems pretty good to pick up. I'm not sure if you'd necessarily want multiple copies of it though, thanks to all the Flesh Hounds. You would really be fielding a bit of a who let the dogs out list if you got more than one copy of this. Sticking with the Chaos Demons, both the Nurgle and the Tzeentch boxes have unfortunately been phased out by Games Workshop, but they still do have Start Collecting Demons of Slaanesh on offer, if you do want some twisted minions of the Dark Prince. Again, this one's one of the smaller box sets. It costs £57.50, $95 or €75, and in it you get 10 Demonettes, 5 Seekers, and then basically 2 Seeker Chariot kits which you can combine together to make an Exalted Seeker Chariot. Discount wise, it's kind of middle of the road for Games Workshop, around about 30%. As kits go, they do tend to be slightly on the older side for Slaanesh. They have come out with some nice new fiends and characters and things since these dropped. But on the other hand, at least in terms of plastic for money, it is on the higher end, at least as Games Workshop box sets go. In-game in the new Demon Codex, it seems like the Demonettes and the Chariots are kind of okay. The Seekers do seem to be a bit on the underwhelming side. And in general, if you do just want to start Slaanesh Demons, it seems pretty reasonable as a jumping off point. 3 out of the main 4 non-character kits in a discounted box. I feel like this is one that you could get a couple of box sets for if you wanted to. Next up, we've got Combat Patrol Tau Empire. This one gets you an ethereal 10 Fire Warriors that can be built as breaches or strikes, 3 stealth suits and their marker drone, and the Ghost Kill and their 2 extra stealth drones. This one gets you £125 worth of models, around about a 28% discount, neither good nor bad, so it's a pretty reasonable start to getting a whole bunch of Fire Warriors and battle suits on the board. Models wise, most of them hold up really quite well I think. The stealth suits are the oldest models in the set here, though even they look pretty fine in my opinion. In game terms, currently the ethereal is absolutely great, the stealth suits and the Fire Warriors are okay, maybe the Ghost Kill a little bit on the weaker side, and in general the box set does feel like it maybe has just a slightly similar problem to the Space Marine one, very much Tau or a stealth carder type theme, as opposed to maybe the more battle line units like Crisis suits or things like that. I feel for general purpose use, the previous one that they had with the Fire Warriors and Crisis suits was very good. I'd say this one's still fine, but just doesn't really seem very standout. An okay discount and okay unit mix, but a little bit stealth heavy maybe. Moving on and back to Space Marines again, we have Combat Patrol Black Templars. This one's a relatively recent offering, coming out when Games Workshop dropped the new Primaris Black Templar range, and it is quite nice to see a few themed Black Templar miniatures in the box. You get the Marshal, their unique captain, the Crusader Squad Troops kit with 6 Initiates and 4 Neophytes, kind of like Primaris Scouts, and besides that you also get 5 Intercessors, the Impulsor, and also the Black Templar upgrade sprue. Model wise it isn't terrible whether or not you want the upgrades, 28% or going up to 39% if you did want them. I will say that at least compared with some of the other chapters upgrades, the Black Templar one is at least fairly generous. Besides just shoulder pads and things, you do actually get some fun relic weapons and things, shotgun options for the Neophytes if you want them, and even a fun multi-melter that you can tack on to some of your battle tanks. As model selections go, it is quite nice to see their unique troops and a unique character leading the box. The standard Intercessors and the Impulsor do really feel a bit on the filler side though. It's hard to see the Intercessors as all that exciting if you've already got a big troops choice already. I feel like if they wanted to make this box pretty much perfect, then swapping some Intercessors out for those Sword Brethren to maybe ride in the Impulsor, that would have been a lot better. In game, the battle line troops are pretty solid for Black Templars. The Impulsor and the Marshal maybe aren't quite so strong. You're probably better off with the unique characters to lead the army, things like Helbrecht or Grimoldus. In general though, I do think that it's quite a good starting point for Black Templars. The upgrade sprue is pretty fun. I'm not really sure I'd be that tempted to get more than one copy of this one though, due to the Marshal sculpts and having multiple Impulsors. It does get you some cool bits though, and some unique miniatures to put on the board. Next up we've got Combat Patrol Necrons. In this one we've got the Overlord, 10 Death Marks that you can also build as Immortals, 3 Tomb Blades, and a Night Scythe or Doom Scythe. This adds up to a fair amount worth of plastic from Games Workshop, £142, so a fairly decent 37% discount. and I feel like this one combines quite nicely with the 40k starter box sets. You could pick up Recruit or Elite and add this to the mix, and you've got quite a decent Necron army on the go for cheap. All of these Necrons are from the previous Necron range that was already out before the era of Indomitus. I think all the models do hold up pretty nicely though. Perhaps the Tomb Blades and the Scythe are a little bit more like them or dislike them, depending on whether you think the aesthetics look cool. In game, Immortals are pretty solid for troops choices now. The Overlord's pretty reasonable, with a Resurrection Orb to reanimate some warriors or something. Tomb Blade's got a big points drop and are quite efficient in the world of Nephilim, and even the Doomscythe is looking a bit more efficient now with that anti-tank Death Ray. In general, I'd rate this as just an all-around pretty strong and solid box, reasonable discount, good mix of miniatures, certainly quite an easy way to get a bunch of Necrons on the table. Next up, we've got Combat Patrol Tyranids, another very swarmy one. In this one, you get a Hive Tyrant that can be built either as a Swarm Lord, Foot 1 or Winged 1, a massive 30 Termagants that also come with 3 Ripper bases, and a unit of 3 Warriors. Overall, this comes to £134, so a 33% discount compared with standard. Not a bad amount. Obviously, this one is a very hoardy box set, but I think it does make a bit more sense for Tyranids to go this way than things like Deathguard or Thousand Sons. Hordes of Gaunts are fairly iconic for them. Generally, I feel that this is the sort of box set that some people are absolutely going to love, and some people really aren't going to be that bothered about. The Termagants themselves will give you a whole bunch of chaff infantry, though arguably out of the swarms they're one of the weaker ones at the moment, maybe a bit subpar to Gargoyles or Hormagaunts, unless you're bringing a Turvagon along. I do think though that the other options, the Hive Tyrant and the Tyranid Warriors, are really some of the most iconic and strong units in the book at the moment, and having them both in this combat patrol is pretty excellent. Models wise, both the Warriors and the Hive Tyrant are sort of medium-aged plastic kits. I think they both hold up fairly well, though I must admit the Termagants are an older one. They do have some mould line issues and are fairly simple miniatures, even if that's not maybe the biggest deal when they're in a massive swarm. On the plus side, it does mean that they're pretty easy to paint up and get on the table with just some carapace and flesh colours. I think if I were starting Tyranids, I would pick up a box of this. The Hive Tyrant and the Warriors are great, and then unless you really want to go for an apocalyptic sized swarm, then most of your chaff needs are met. I might be tempted to add on a Turvagon to this to buff the Gaunts and respawn them a bit. That one does look like it could be a very good next logical step after this box set. Next up, we've got Combat Patrol Orks. This one's a relatively recent one with a lot of new miniatures, the new Warboss in Mega Armor with the great big axe, 3 Death Copters and 2 sets of the new Boy Sculpts, and then 1 Death Dread. Discount wise, it's £156, so around a 43% discount compared with buying separately, provided you did want these kits, and it is quite nice to get that with quite so many nice new sculpts from the most recent Orc range refresh. I think the unit mix is pretty good, a decent amount of boys on the table, and then some good support. The only real issue that stops me from ranking this amongst the top of the Combat Patrol box sets is the Orc Boys kit itself. While I do really quite like the models, it is kind of annoying that within the set you don't have the option of arming them all, say, with shooters or all with choppers. You get a bit of an annoying mix in the box sets, and also have to take one as a knob and one as a special weapon, even if you might not want to. It does maybe take the shine off them a little bit, particularly as Games Workshop also has the other older boys kit still for sale on their website. That one's cheaper, you get one more miniature, and you do get more flexible options with them. It is a bit frustrating that Games Workshop made some very nice new Orc miniatures, and then made the kit a little bit annoying in terms of game purposes, but there's no denying if you just want to get a nice Orc horde on the table, this box set will certainly help you do that. Pretty much all the miniatures are pretty usable in game as well, perhaps the Death Dread is just a little bit underwhelming. Next up we have the Chaos Space Marines. Combat Patrol Chaos Space Marines includes a Dark Apostle, 10 standard legionaries, though it is the normal kit and not the upgraded one with the Balefire Acolyte or anything in, 5 Havocs and 1 Hellbrute. All of that comes to around £131, and it's a pretty reasonable discount at 32%. Not particularly great, but not particularly low either. In general, I feel like this is just a fairly solid standard issue Combat Patrol from Games Workshop, a good balance of troops and damage dealers. Legionaries are handy enough for the troop slots, Havocs do deal some pretty decent damage and are quite nice with a Mark of Slaanesh. The Dark Apostle is currently quite a competitive choice, throwing Illusory Supplication on some Terminators or something, and all the miniatures are from the more recent refreshed line of Chaos Space Marines. I think all of them hold up really quite well by current standards. In game, maybe the Hellbrute isn't one of the most efficient choices in the world, but it's still very usable and can deal out a fair amount of fire support. Overall, I think it's just a pretty interesting choice to start a Chaos Space Marine army. You might be a little bit less tempted to take multiple Dark Apostles unless you're playing Word Bearers or something, which might limit you wanting to get more than one copy of it though. So finally, I looked through the combat patrol boxes. A lot of them are pretty solid and usable for their own armies, but I do feel that maybe these 5 perhaps stand out more than most as being particularly good entries into the line, and maybe better than the majority of the boxes that Games Workshop has on offer without too many drawbacks. First up, we have Combat Patrol Adepta Sororitas, the one for the Sisters of Battle, and in here you get a Canoness, 10 Battle Sisters, 3 Arco-Flagellants, 4 Repentia plus a Repentia Superior, 5 Seraphim, a Penitent Engine, and a Sororitas Rhino too. Again, kind of like the Space Marine Vanguard Phobos one, these ones are monopose miniatures. You don't have options as to what war gear you can equip them with, the only multi-part kit in the box is that Rhino. However, this does translate to being really quite a nice discount on the miniatures, 48% off and the highest out of any combat patrol, though admittedly that is comparing against the full kits, which do get you more options and things. For me though, I think that the big discount is worth the trade-off here. Some people maybe aren't such a fan of this, as it gets you lots of small individual units, but personally I feel that's quite a good thing. Maybe I'm just one of the people who would just quite like to have lots of small little units running around rather than a few really big ones. But I think it just really is quite fun to be able to paint up so many different squads from different parts of the range, and have lots of fun units running about. I think such a big discount is pretty handy for the Sisters of Battle, which in general are a very expensive army to get into, so the existence of this box set is pretty helpful. And what's more, I'd argue that literally every single one of these units can be usable and competitive in game. The Sisters of Battle are really quite strong right now. The Sisters can hold some home field objectives. Seraphim went down in points recently. Both the Redemptia and the Arco-Flagellants hit very hard. The Penitent Engine is just fairly tanky and pretty efficient with those flamers, and the characters are both quite efficient leadership choices. Honestly, I just really like this box set, as you can probably tell. If I were ever getting into Sisters of Battle, I would start by picking up at least 2 of these. That could turn those mini squads into something actually genuinely big and threatening enough, and I'd likely convert the Repentia Superior into another HQ choice, maybe into a Palatine. Then as you expand the army, flesh out with some of the more multi-part kits. That could add a little bit in terms of diversity of different models, and you're well on your way to collecting a Sisters of Battle army for far cheaper than you normally would. Next up, we've got Combat Patrol Adeptus Custodes. In this one, you get 5 Custodian Guard, 3 Virtus Praetors, and 10 Sisters of Silence. The Sisters of Silence can be built up either as the Witch Seekers, Vigilators, or Prosecutors, and the Custodian Guard can give you the option for a Vexilla and potentially a Shield Captain on foot. Overall, it's a pretty solid discount from Games Workshop at 35%, but I think perhaps the main reason that this one stands out is that I think it's the highest points cost out of any one box set out of these combat patrols. If you just want to get loads of points for 40k on the table very cheaply, then if you use the character options, then this is a great choice. The bikes and infantry are pretty much the backbone of the army. The characters are usable, maybe the Sisters are just a little bit on the niche side, but could still be very good for holding down home objectives and providing their useful anti-psyker stratagems. The models are all pretty nice quality in my opinion, all coming from the relatively recent Adeptus Custodes range. I think maybe the only major downside of the box is that it's really quite heavy on the Sisters of Silence, which you might not want an absolute ton of if you are playing Adeptus Custodes mainly for the Custodes and not the Sisters. If I were to get into Adeptus Custodes in a really big way, I'd probably pick up 2 copies of this box set, and then probably eBay a couple of the squads of the Sisters of Silence, as I think at least at this point I probably wouldn't want to have 20 all in one list. I guess if you just wanted to have the models in the roster though, you could perhaps just model up a couple of the standard ones with bolters, and then maybe have a unit of Vigilators and Witch Seekers to switch out to for a bit of unit variety. Still though, it's really quite nice to have this much of a big chunk of an army available, all in one box. Next up we get to Combat Patrol Genestealer Cults, and again this one really is another unusually generous offering from Games Workshop. In the box you get a Magus, pictured at the front, 2 units of 10 Neophytes, 1 unit of 5 Aberrants, 1 unit of 5 Acolytes that you can also build as hybrid metamorphs to, and then 1 Goliath truck that can be built as a rock grinder. Again, like the Sisters of Battle, the Genestealer Cult are one of the more expensive factions to collect in Warhammer 40k, so having a pretty heavy discount set out of them I think is very useful. Unlike the Sisters of Battle though, who also get a fairly similar discount compared with their multi-part kits, all of these are the multi-part kits here, so you've got all the options to change out the war gear and even change one unit from one thing to another. It's pretty impressive to see the vast majority of the Genestealer Cult range all collected here in one box. I think the only major things that you're missing are the Ridge Runner and the bikes. On top of that, the Genestealer Cult Codex is a pretty well internally balanced one, so most of the choices are very relevant for competitive armies. I'd say just about everything is very usable, maybe the Aberrants are a tiny bit more niche. I do feel like they could come down in points at least a little bit. All of them are pretty new and recent Genestealer kits, very nicely detailed and well made, though I feel like their aesthetic is one that people either love or hate, a bit of an unusual mix of mining gear and mutated aliens, maybe a little bit less mainstream than plenty of other 40k armies. Overall though, this is a very solid box indeed, and again definitely one that you could think about getting multiple copies of if you really wanted to go for Genestealer Cults in a big way. It's to get you an awful lot of models on the table for relatively cheap, including some fancy elites and vehicles. Moving on, we've got Combat Patrol Aeldari. In this one you get a Farseer, 6 Wind Rider jet bikes, 10 Guardians with their weapon platform, plus a Wraith Lord. Overall that winds up being just north of £150, giving you around a 40% discount overall. In general, I do really quite like the unit mix for this one. The Guardians are pretty much the iconic troops choice, and they've got nice new models now, so a really good one to have in the set. The Farseer is pretty much the linchpin of just about every Eldar list, so always good to have one of those. And then at least in the new codex, both the Wind Rider jet bikes and the Wraith Lords are very usable indeed, as well as being really iconic units for the army. I suppose if I had one criticism of the box set, it might be that it's just a little bit jet bike heavy. It might not have hurt to swap out the second unit of Wind Riders for something else, but having a trusty core of jet bikes I don't think is a particularly bad thing for an Eldar collector going forwards. They are one of the iconic units that tends to cycle around and usually gets improvements each time a new book drops. Overall, I feel like the unit mix plus the fairly decent discount do make this one a bit more standout to me. Maybe not quite as much as the previous 3 that we've mentioned, but still very, very good. Finally, on my personal picks of strong combat patrols, we have Combat Patrol Drukhari. In this one you get an Archon, 10 Cavalite Warriors, 5 Incubi, a Raider and a Ravager. Overall this one costs £145, so a pretty reasonable discount at 39%, and I feel like for this one the thing that stands out for me is the unit mix, just a really nice set of miniatures that feels very core to the faction. I feel like for the Drukhari the Cabals really feel like the main core of the force, with the Witches and the Homunculi adding on, so I feel like they're perhaps the most reasonable choice to have front and centre in the combat patrol. The generic Archon plus the Warriors are great, Incubi are some very scary shock elites, and then you get not one but 2 fast skimmers going around, blasting out a bunch of lance shots and transporting your units to the battle. I guess theoretically, if you did want to, you could think about trying to magnetise the Ravager so you could either field it as a Raider or a Ravager. That could give you a bit more flexibility as to how you field the models. In-game, again, the Drukhari Codex is one that's really quite balanced internally. I feel that literally every single one of these units is fairly strong and usable for the right role. Maybe the Cabalites just feeling a little bit of competition from cheap and tough racks. It can still be quite interesting for a unit that wants to put out a bit of firepower out of fast transports though. Overall though, I think due to unit composition, I think it is pretty great. If I were starting Drukhari from a standing start, I would be very tempted to get 2 of them. That'd give you a hefty contingent of 4 gunboats, plus plenty of twisted denizens to put in them. So with the Dark Eldar out the way, that just about brings us to the end of our look through Games Workshop's Combat Patrol box sets. Let me know what you think and what your experiences are with them, which ones have you picked up and found good use out of, and would you rate any of them higher or lower than I have here. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, which is how I can afford to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly. If you have been finding these videos useful and you'd like to help keep the content coming, feel free to check out the link down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.